Hello again and welcome to another Warlord Wednesday, the episode of the week where we talk about all things bolt action. In today's episode, we continue our unit review series, this time taking a look at one of the most iconic British heavy tanks of the war. I am, of course, talking about the mighty Churchill. With its distinctive boxy shape, thick armor, and popularity in modern video games such as Company of Heroes, the Churchill has become one of the easily most recognizable tanks of World War II. And Warlord Games clearly knows this because they now include Churchills in many of their British starter armies. But the big question is this tank any good on the tabletop? Well, there's only one way to find out. Let's dive right into today's video. So let's begin with a unit overview. What the hell is this thing? Well, the Churchill is a tank, and it is a heavy tank at that. This means that it starts off with a damage value of 10 plus. This puts it in the same ballpark as things like the German Tiger tank, so it's definitely a serious bit of kit. However, keen-eyed observers may have noticed that I said starts off at armor 10. One of the big things about the Churchill is because it was introduced in the middle of the war, it ended up going through lots of revisions and evolutions. And by the late war, it is possible to actually take Churchills as a super heavy tank. That's right, the Brits have got armor that can contend with the German King Tiger. As well as having a variety of armor values, the Churchill also comes with a huge smorgasbord of different weapon options. It can take anything from light howitzers and light anti-tank guns all the way up to vehicle mounted flamethrowers and everyone's favorite option, the flying dustbin, the Churchill AVRE, which is a heavy howitzer with some really cool unique rules. Don't worry if you're a new player and this all sounds very confusing. You're not sure which mark you should take, which weapon you should give it. Don't worry. We'll cover all the different types of Churchill later on in the deep dive section of this video. For now, what we'll do is we'll have a brief overview of the standard Churchill, the Mark IV, the one that came into production at the middle of the war and which can very much be considered the baseline for other Churchill models. So with that said, the infantry tank Mark IV Churchill 3, which you can find on page 44 of your Armies of Great Britain book, comes as standard with a damage value of 10 plus, making it a heavy tank, and that is pretty durable. It comes equipped with a turret-mounted 6-pounder medium anti-tank gun and 2 MMGs, one in the hull and one coaxially mounted alongside the anti-tank gun. As for its points cost, the Churchill is surprisingly affordable. At inexperienced veterancy, it is 212 points, making it almost half the cost of a regular German Tiger. If you decide to take the Churchill as regular itself, it comes in at 265, which is still very reasonable, and you might even be tempted to spring for it being veteran because it still just comes in at or by heavy tank standards, paltry 318 points. But why is the Churchill so affordable? Well, this kind of naturally leads us on to the deep dive of this unit. Let's lift up the rock, take a look at the nitty-gritty details underneath, and also explore some of the variants you can take for this tank. Straight off the bat, I want to say I think the Churchill is a really, really good unit. Very, very strong, especially in less competitive games and more friendly ones where people are likely to turn up with bigger tanks. Strictly speaking, the Churchill isn't considered meta. Most competitive players with action will focus on spamming light tanks and tankettes, things that get lots and lots of machine guns for a very reasonable price point, and instead their anti-tank will be focused more around infantry stuff. But I think the Churchill is an exception to this, and the reason is how damn affordable many of the different variants are. Until you start getting into the super heavy tanks, you are getting heavy armor onto the battlefield for barely more than the cost of some medium armor of other factions. For example, if I was going to take a German Panzer IV, one of the most common tanks you are likely to face off against as a British player, that costs 235 points. For just 30 points more, I can get a tank with heavy armor. And heavy armor really does radically alter the dynamic of the game. Many German players will tell you from the other side of the fence, they will hold their hands up and go, when I bring a Tiger, it radically alters the dynamic of the game. Because Tiger tanks and heavy armor are a very different beast. You really need some serious AT to punch through that. You can't get away with a medium anti-tank gun and expect that to cover all your bases. When heavy armor rolls onto the field, if you don't have dedicated heavy AT, it might just roll over your forces. But the big problem that the German players tend to find with their heavy armor is it costs them an arm and a leg. A regular Tiger tank with just an extra pintle mounted MMG, and typically you want to take that pintle, is going to come in at 410 points. 410 in a standard 1000 point game. That is over 40% of the German players' allowance in a single vehicle. That's going to massively cut into the other units they can take, and it's going to start making the list, well, have to cut corners, and they're going to have problems. They're not going to be able to cover all of their bases. But the Churchill doesn't have that problem. The Churchill is like a medium tank. It's relatively affordable, packs a good punch, and doesn't break the bank. You can afford all the other toys that you need in your list. And I think that truly is one of the biggest strengths of the Churchill. It's heavy armor at a budget price. Now, I know what you're thinking. Mordian Glory, you said bot action was more balanced, but apparently the Germans are just getting shafted on the points front. Why is that? Actually, there's a really simple explanation, and it comes down to the design philosophy behind each tank. So, German tanks typically have a gun that is bigger than their weight class. So a Panzer IV, which is a medium tank, will have a heavy anti-tank gun. A Tiger, which is a heavy tank, will have a super heavy anti-tank gun. Essentially, the Germans are paying a really high premium for that excellent firepower. But the British tanks follow a different path. They focus less on firepower and, well, being more tanky. You look at the Matilda II early in the war, that is a medium tank in an era where most people are rocking light tanks, and yet it's only got the same light AT gun as everyone else. The Churchill's very similar. It's a heavy tank at a time when a lot of people are rocking medium tanks as their standard armor, but it's only got a medium anti-tank gun just like everybody else. To try and boil this all down into one simple sentence, German tanks are more expensive, but they're actually expected to do more and kill enemy units. British tanks are generally cheaper, but they're kind of just there to outlast the enemy and be a big brick. But now let's move on to another advantage of the Churchill, and one which I think is often overlooked. A lot of players in bot action tend to focus on playing late war. That's because you can get all your toys. But it shouldn't be forgotten that the Churchill is a heavy tank, which is very affordable, which can be taken in the mid-war period. This is something that can really catch a lot of players off guard. Now sure, there are other mid-war heavy tanks. You do have the Tiger for the Germans, but as we've already said, that's very expensive. And you also have the KV-1 for the Russians, but that too is significantly more expensive than the Churchill. The KV-1, I think, comes in at 350 points. And it's because it's armoured all round, but it's very similarly armed to the Churchill. It's got that medium AT gun and a couple of MMGs. It's just because it's really, really bloated with lots of extra special rules that its points tends to go through the roof. Now, because of these tanks, other tanks being so expensive, you don't tend to see them fielded. Tigers may be taken in a fun, memey list, same with the KV-1, but by and large, those factions are going to stick to cheaper, lighter, medium tanks. But the Churchill is a heavy tank which is a very real threat, something that if you bring to the table regularly, your local bot action meta, your local gaming group is going to have to start taking it into account, because if they don't, it's really going to dominate them. Let me put this into perspective. In the mid-war, one of the most popular tanks for German players to take is the Panzer III. There's a variant which is a light tank that comes with a medium AT gun. German players love this thing because it's like 155 points and you get all the advantages of the medium AT gun, but you don't have to pay for the medium armor. You're basically saving about 50 or so points. But another more important reason, and one that you can definitely take advantage of, is for many German players, they consider the medium AT gun of that cheap Panzer III more than enough to deal with the types of allied armor they're going to encounter, which are typically medium tanks. Things like early war Shermans, T-34s, and Matilda tanks of the British. That Panzer III can handle those no problem. Sure, it's a little bit less durable than them, but if it gets the first shot off, it wouldn't be too bad. And I know I'm going off a bit of a tangent here, but a lot of those tanks are going to come with either debilitating rules like the Shermans, easily catching fire, thin sides, or going to have lighter anti-tank weapons like the Matilda's light AT. The Churchill completely and utterly dunks on this whole philosophy. Will completely destroy this mindset. If a German player turns up with a Panzer III with a light armor hull and a medium anti-tank gun, your Churchill is just going to dominate it so hard. Because your Churchill, with its medium AT gun, even at long range, is going to have a 50-50 chance of damaging that Panzer III. Because if you get a 4 with your AP plus 4 at long range, you are going to be getting a glance. On the other hand, the Panzer III is going to need a 6 to glance you at long range. So you have a 50-50 chance, that's not bad odds in bolt action terms with one-shot weapons, to start really hammering that Panzer III, and it has a 16% chance of glancing you. And then it only has another 16% chance on top of that for setting you on fire, and then you have to fail a morale test for your tank to be knocked out. Look, it's not even in the same ballpark. You have a 33% chance, followed by a 50% chance of just knocking that Panzer III out. It's got a 16% followed by a 16% followed by you failing your morale check, which if you've taken like one pin on a regular tank, you have a greater than 50% chance of passing. There's so many barriers in the way of that Panzer III and that tank duel, and there's so few in your way with the Churchill. But now let us continue on from the mid-war into the late war. And I think the best way of covering this is by going through the rich tapestry, the many variants of the Churchill tank. These can be broken down into 3 categories. You've got your heavy tanks, you've got your super heavy tanks, and you've also got your specialist variants. Now, we've already extensively covered the Churchill 3, and the next variant, the Churchill 4, is basically identical. I don't know the historical reasons for the difference in these marks. I'm sure that someone down the comment section can enlighten me. But in terms of bolt action rules, these things are exactly the same. Same weapon loadout, medium AT gun, 2 MMGs, heavy armor, and their points costs are exactly the same as well. But then we get to the Churchill 6, and this is a slightly more expensive variant. It looks very similar on the surface. It's a heavy tank, it's got the same anti-tank gun, medium AT, and it's got the 2 MMGs. The big difference is this one is armed with a 75mm medium anti-tank gun rather than the 6-pounder. This allows it to take advantage of a bigger HE profile. First 2 Churchills just had your standard 1-inch template for your medium AT gun, but the Churchill 6 has a 75mm HE 2-inch template, essentially giving it double the blast radius and actually making it quite effective at dealing with enemy infantry. If you're used to things like the Sherman tank with its bigger HE profile, it's essentially the same thing here. Now, you do pay a little bit more for this. In experience, you're going to be paying 222 points. At regular, you'll be paying 275, and at veteran 328. So overall at each level it's about a 10-point increase. Honestly, it's probably worth it. if you're already taking a Churchill, it's a very good idea to spend an extra 10 points to give it some proper HE potential. After this, we get to the super heavy Churchills. These things have got a damage value of 11 plus. The first one is the Churchill 7. At inexperienced, it's going to cost you 348 points. At regular, 435, and at veteran, 522. That is pretty bloody eye-watering in comparison to the regular Churchill. Interestingly, it doesn't come with that much more extra firepower. It has got... The Mark 7 comes with a turret-mounted 75mm medium anti-tank gun with that 2-inch HE. Same as the heavy Churchills we saw before. It doesn't get loads and loads of extra guns. It's still only got the 2 MMGs, one of which is coaxial. Basically, you're paying almost 200 points more just to have that damage value 11 plus. It's a lot of points. You also have got the Mark 8, which is essentially the same points, but has got a light howitzer instead. In my opinion, it doesn't matter which one you go for. Both of these super heavy Churchills give up the main advantage that the Churchill Tank has, which is it's very affordable. It could dominate the battlefield for a low price point. I would probably leave the super heavy Churchills at home unless you're playing a more fun narrative game. We then have the specialist variants of the Churchill. The first one we're going to look at is the AVRE. This is an absolute meme unit. It's also one of the more popular variants. And that's because it comes with the unbelievably powerful Petard heavy mortar. This thing was nicknamed the Flying Dustbin in real life because of how large its shells were. You take a regular Churchill, heavy tank variant, you keep its MMGs, and then in the turret, rather than having a eloquent medium anti-tank gun, you decide to go full caveman and stick a heavy howitzer in there. It's a 4-inch template, guys. If you hit an infantry unit, it will instantly be turned into red vapor. If you hit a tank with it, you'll instantly pin it out. It's a wildly powerful weapon, and incredibly, at regular, it only costs 290 points. At veteran, it's 348. You can't even take this thing as inexperienced. So what's the catch? Well, it does have a special rule called Petard Mortar. The heavy howitzer fitted on the Churchill AVRE cannot be fired at long range. This means that, essentially, it has a 36-inch range. You can't really fire this indirect because its indirect range is 36 to 84. So you're never going to be able to get that exactly on. So you have to fire it direct. So you're going to have to take into account all the hit modifiers, which could be a big problem with this one-shot weapon. And you've also got to remember that because it can't fire at long range, its range isn't halved, it can't fire at long range. This means that if it does have to get into a tank duel, more than likely, it's going to have to spend a turn or two trundling forward. And I say trundling because it is slow. Trundling forward, it's going to have to endure some serious anti-tank firepower because it's going to draw it all down on it. And if it manages to survive that, it then might just miss. It's a very powerful weapon, and it is a pretty drawable tank, but the moment this thing rolls onto the battlefield, expect it to draw all the firepower, and it may not even hit when it finally gets into range of its target. But if you thought the AVRE was funny, wait until you see the Churchill Crocodile. This is a super heavy variant of the Churchill, so it's going to cost you a pretty penny. 485 points at regular, 582 at veteran. You can't take it as inexperienced. But it does have that damage value 11 plus. It comes equipped with a 75mm anti-tank gun in the turret. That's pretty good. Nice and versatile. Oh wait, instead of having a hull medium machine gun, it's got a hull mounted vehicle flamethrower. It's even got this little Bowser that trails behind it. It's insane. It's a very, very expensive tank. The flamethrower is pretty good. Because it's a vehicle mounted flamethrower, it's got a 12-inch range rather than a 6-inch range. It still does D6 plus 1 hits. It's still got that pen value of +3. And of course, it does all of the glorious things that flamethrowers do. If you're not aware, if you're maybe coming over from 40k into bolt action, flamethrowers are one of the most powerful weapons you can get in the game. Vehicle flamethrowers take that to a whole new level. So the Churchill Crocodile is very good. I'm not going to deny that. Being able to take a medium flamethrower on a good vehicle like this, and also the fact that it has a special rule called jettison fuel trailer, so it doesn't just explode the moment that you start penetrating it. It can just be like, nope, we're not going to set on fire today. So it has all the advantages of a vehicle flamethrower, none of the disadvantages. The only problem with it is it's slow, again, and it's very, very pricey. I think it's probably prohibitively pricey in a standard game. But if you were maybe playing a little bit more expensive, like a little bit more higher points level game, like 1250 points, or you're playing a bit of a meme game or tank war, something like that, you could probably afford to chuck a Churchill Crocodile in. But it's definitely more of a fun unit than a competitive one. And that purely comes down to its quite expensive price point. So that covers most of the common variants of the Churchill you are likely to use or encounter on the tabletop. But guys, there's a whole bunch more we've not even touched on. You've got things like the Mark 1 and the Mark 2, the really early variants that come equipped with light AT guns with turret and howitzers in the hull. They're pretty wild, and on paper, they're very effective. I don't want to go into great detail on those simply because they're not a very common variant. You're not likely to come across them on the battlefield, and their combat history is also relatively limited. I think maybe a couple of Mark IIs took part in North Africa. The majority of them were involved in the failed deep raid. So maybe if you were going to do a deep raid reenactment and you were going to use a lot of the units that took part in that thing, they'd be useful. But the majority of Churchills that saw action were the Mark III and onwards. Now, I'm sure that there will be some history boffins out there that will be able to go, actually, there's a Mark II that took part in this particular battle in 1944. Of course, this is World War II. They press everything to service all the time. But when we're talking in generalizations, we tend to say that Mark III was where the standard Churchill sort of began, and that's the one that saw a lot of the combat, and it was those ones and beyond that were produced in the greatest numbers. And that is an important factor to take into account, because at the end of the day, bolt action, even though it's a bit more arcadey, is a historical war game, and people tend to prefer to play with armies that might have actually, and with units that might have actually seen combat. It's why maybe in the competitive scene, you'll see a lot of Japanese players use like Horos, but in the more casual scene, you won't really come across them because they were only used for home island defense and they never actually saw combat. So most of the Churchills that we've talked about today are ones that have actually got quite a lot of historical combat operations behind them, and as a result, the ones that players tend to gravitate towards. And of course, many of the variants we talked about have got a plastic kit as well, so they're much easier for people to get into. They don't have to worry about messing around with fiddly resin kits or anything like that. My point is that there is many different variants of the Churchill. If you go looking, you will definitely find one that suits your needs. Overall, I think that this tank is fantastic. I give it an 8 out of 10, which is a rare thing for me to give a heavy tank in the game about action, but it's just good. Whilst it's not conventionally competitive, it is very affordable, and being able to access heavy armor at such an extremely low price point is very potent on the battlefield. But of course, all of this is just like my opinion, man. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. What is your favorite variant of the Churchill? And are there any other heavy tanks, Allied or Axis, that you want me to cover in future unit reviews? I hope you enjoyed today's video, and if you did, make sure you smash that like button and of course, subscribe to never miss an episode. And I just want to take a moment to say a massive thank you to all of the channel members and patrons. You guys are amazing. You truly are the lifeblood of the channel, and I couldn't do this full time without you. And I want to take a moment to say a special thank you to all of my top tier supporters. These are the War Masters, the people who have truly gone above and beyond the call of duty. So thank you so much to Alan Blunt III, Amy DeSweet, Bon Bon Vert, Ken Starr, Mark Panconi, Ross Miller, Swordfish Trombone, John Stubbs, Nick Walsh, Diesel Fox, and August Varney. Once again, guys, thank you. Genuinely couldn't do this without you. Your incredible and generous support just makes a huge, huge difference. I hope you all enjoyed today's video. Thank you for watching. And of course, as always, I'll see you guys next time.